So Canada just walked away from the United States, not from a single negotiation, not from one trade deal, from the entire framework. 5 formal withdrawal notices filed simultaneously before the sun came up in Washington. USMCA, energy export agreements, defense procurement partnerships, agricultural cooperation frameworks, and foreign investment protocols. 5 pillars of the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in the Western Hemisphere. 5 legal filings that began the administrative process of disentangling 2 economies that have been building toward each other for 70 years. Mark Carney didn't hold a fiery press conference. He didn't threaten retaliation. He didn't demand better terms. He released a written statement, 4 paragraphs, no adjectives, pure procedure, announcing that Canada had initiated formal withdrawal processes from its principal trade and economic agreements with the United States effective immediately. With the legally required notice periods running from today, Trump erupted, but not the way he usually erupts, not the volcanic, loud, aggressive eruption the world has come to expect. This one was different. Aides described it as panicked because for the first time in the entire trade conflict, there was nothing to counteroffer. You can fight an opponent who wants something from you. You can't fight someone who wants nothing from you anymore. You can't negotiate with someone who's already left. Warren Buffett said the true cost of a relationship is only visible when it ends, and that America is about to discover just how much of its economy was built on the assumption that Canada would always be there. When you understand what those 5 withdrawal notices actually mean, what they affect, how long they take to undo, and why they can't simply be reversed by a phone call or a new deal, you'll understand why this isn't a negotiating tactic. This is a departure. And departures, unlike tariffs, don't have an off switch. Hit subscribe because this is the most significant shift in North American economic relations in 70 years. Let me walk you through how we got here. Because this wasn't an impulse. This was the end of a process, a long, patient, painful process during which Canada tried everything else first. Over the past 18 months, Canada has tried every approach available to a nation being mistreated by a larger partner, every single one. It tried negotiation. Carney sat at the table in good faith, made genuine concessions on market access, proposed comprehensive frameworks that addressed American concerns on trade balance, offered resource partnerships that would have strengthened American supply chains for decades. The response was insults and unilateral escalation. Every time Canada came to the table ready to negotiate, the table got flipped. It tried fact-checking. Carney stood at podiums with American data from American agencies and corrected 7 specific lies about Canadian trade, Canadian military contributions, Canadian economic dependency. Each correction documented, sourced, and independently verified. The response was fake news and more lies. The corrections were accurate. The lies continued unchanged. 7 false claims about the trade deficit, about military freeloading, about economic dependency, about Canadian tariffs, about dairy, about jobs, about energy. Each one disproven, none of them retracted. It tried patience, absorbing the 51st state rhetoric that reduced 1 5, 8-year-old democracy to an American territory. Absorbing the frozen wasteland characterization that dismissed everything Canadians have built. Absorbing the casual repeated suggestion that Canadian sovereignty is fictional. The response was escalation. The insults got worse, not better. Patience was interpreted as weakness, and weakness invited more contempt. It tried exposing hypocrisy, revealing that Trump's 100% tariffs came with secret exemptions for his donors, that the fine print protected 14 companies that had paid for access while 330 million Americans paid double. The response was 3 contradictory official explanations and a doubling down on threats. It tried dignity. Carney stood on Parliament Hill and told the world, Canada doesn't live because of the United States. 7 words, 200 million views, the most shared political statement of the year. The response was a social media post calling Canada lucky to have us as a neighbor, which proved the point it was attempting to refute. And then the tweet at 2:17 a.m. A total ban on Canadian goods composed in the middle of the night, prompted by a television segment about dairy without consulting a single member of the United States government. The ban collapsed in 72 hours, but the message it sent was permanent. This is a country that will upend its most important trading relationship on a whim at 2 inches the morning because the president saw something on television that made him angry. That was the moment. Not because the ban was damaging. It was reversed before it could do real harm, but because it demonstrated with perfect clarity that no amount of negotiation, fact-checking, patience, dignity, or good faith would change the fundamental dynamic. The relationship was not recoverable from within, and so Canada chose the only option that remained. We tried everything. Carney said in a private meeting with caucus members the week before the withdrawal notices were filed. According to officials who were present, negotiation facts, patience, dignity, exposure, legal challenges, trade diversification as leverage. None of it changed the fundamental reality that the United States views Canada as a subordinate, not a partner. You cannot maintain a trade architecture with a country that treats you as a possession. You can only leave. Canada didn't snap. Canada decided, and the difference between those two words is the difference between something that can be walked back and something that can't. The government of Canada has today initiated formal withdrawal and review processes across 5 principal categories of bilateral economic agreements with the United States. This action follows 18 months of sustained engagement during which Canada pursued every available diplomatic, economic, and legal avenue to preserve the bilateral trade relationship. Those efforts have not been reciprocated. The government of Canada has concluded that the current framework does not serve Canada's interest, does not reflect the mutual respect that bilateral trade requires, and cannot be sustained under conditions in which the United States treats its commitments to Canada as discretionary rather than binding. We wish the American people well. We will pursue our economic future with partners who view Canada as an equal. That's it. No anger, no insults, no frozen wasteland in reverse, just the quiet, devastating language of someone who has made a decision and is executing it. The 5 withdrawal notices hit Washington like 5 separate earthquakes on the same morning. The first and most seismic USMCA, Canada filed formal notification of intent to withdraw from the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement under Article 34.6. The article provides for any party to withdraw with 6 months' notice. Trump signed this agreement himself in 2020. He celebrated it as his signature trade achievement, and Canada just triggered its exit clause. USMCA governs approximately $1.3 trillion in annual trilateral trade. It sets the rules for automotive manufacturing, agricultural commerce, digital trade, intellectual property, labor standards, and dispute resolution between the 3 North American economies. Filing Article 34.6 withdrawal doesn't end these arrangements overnight. The 6-month notice period allows for transition, but it begins the clock. And once the clock starts, every business decision, every investment plan, every supply chain calculation on both sides of the border is made under a cloud of uncertainty that didn't exist the day before. Filing Article 34.6 is the economic equivalent of filing for divorce. You can still talk, you can still negotiate, but the legal process of separation has begun, and everyone knows it. The second notice, energy. Canada announced a comprehensive review of all energy export commitments to the United States, crude oil, natural gas, electricity, and uranium. Not an immediate cutoff, not a dramatic embargo, a formal notice that existing long-term supply arrangements are under review and cannot be assumed to continue in their current form beyond the review period. The language is bureaucratic. The implications are existential. Canada supplies 60% of American crude imports, 98% of pipeline natural gas, electricity for 6 states, uranium for nuclear power plants that generate 20% of American electricity. Putting all of that under review doesn't turn off the taps tomorrow, but it tells every energy planner, every utility company, every refiner operator in America that the supply they've built their operations around is no longer guaranteed. And in the energy business, uncertainty is the crisis. Companies don't wait for the cutoff. They start hedging the moment the review is announced. Prices rise on the uncertainty alone. The third notice, defense procurement. Canada suspended participation in joint U.S. Canada defense procurement programs. The 2 nations have maintained integrated defense industrial cooperation since the 1950s. Canadian companies building components for American weapon systems. American firms supplying Canadian military platforms. joint research and development projects spanning decades. Canada announced that all current joint programs would be paused for review and that future military equipment purchases would be redirected to European, British, and allied Asian suppliers. The immediate impact, billions of dollars in existing contracts frozen. The strategic impact, the most integrated defense partnership in the Western Alliance built over 70 years, beginning to decouple. Pentagon officials were reportedly blindsided, not because they hadn't seen the trade tensions, because they never believed the trade conflict would contaminate the defense relationship. It just did. The fourth notice, agricultural frameworks. Canada suspended bilateral agricultural cooperation agreements covering grain inspection standards, food safety certification protocols, pesticide and chemical harmonization, animal health standards, and cross-border livestock transportation rules. These are the invisible infrastructure of North American food trade. The agreements that allow Canadian grain to move seamlessly to American mills, that allow American beef to be sold in Canadian grocery stores, that keep the North American food supply chain functioning as a single integrated system. Suspending them doesn't stop food trade overnight, but it introduces friction. Inspections, certifications, approvals that used to be automatic now require individual processing. Shipping times increase, costs increase, and the integrated food supply chain that both countries depend on begins to fragment load by load, shipment by shipment. The fifth notice, investment screening. Canada announced that all American acquisitions of Canadian companies, resources, or real estate would immediately be subject to enhanced national security screening. The same level of scrutiny previously reserved for investments from China, Russia, and other nations deemed strategic competitors, American investors attempting to purchase Canadian mining companies, energy assets, technology firms, or agricultural land would now face review timelines of 6 months to a year and could be denied on national security grounds. The message was unmistakable. The United States is no longer treated as a trusted economic partner. It is treated as a potential threat, and American capital, which has flowed freely into Canada for decades, now faces the same barriers as Chinese capital. That's not a tariff. That's a reclassification. And reclassifications are far harder to reverse than tariffs because they reflect a change in how one country views another at the most fundamental level. 5 notices, 5 pillars of the bilateral economic relationship, all filed before breakfast on a Wednesday morning. And each one individually would have been the most significant trade action between the two countries in a generation. Together, they constitute the most comprehensive voluntary economic disengagement between allied nations since the collapse of the British Empire's preferential trade system in the 1960s. Warren Buffett was reached that morning and asked a single question. What does this mean? His answer was the most concise and devastating assessment anyone offered all day. It means the bill has arrived. He paused to let 4 words do the work of 400. For 70 years, the United States built its economy on the assumption that Canada would always be there, that Canadian oil would always flow south through the pipelines we share, that Canadian electricity would always cross the border through the power lines we connected, that Canadian minerals would always supply American industry, that Canadian auto parts would always arrive on time at American assembly plants, that Canadian water would always be shared and Canadian airspace would always be monitored jointly for our mutual defense, that the most integrated bilateral economic relationship in the world would continue functioning regardless of how America treated the partner on the other side. He shook his head slowly. That assumption was never tested because it never needed to be. Canada was always there. Canada was always reliable. Canada was the most dependable partner in American economic history. It always absorbed the insults, the tariffs, the 51st state jokes, the casual disrespect, and kept supplying, kept showing up, kept doing its part of the partnership while the other side took it for granted until today. Today, the most dependable partner in the history of American commerce decided it was done being dependable for someone who treats dependability as weakness. He addressed the true cost, the cost that becomes visible only at the moment of departure. The true cost of any relationship in business and personal life between nations is only visible when it ends. While the relationship is functioning, you never think about what you do without it. You take the supply for granted. You take the partnership for granted. You take the other side's willingness to stay for granted. It's invisible. It's like oxygen. You don't think about it until it's not there. He paused again. And then one morning you wake up and they've filed 5 withdrawal notices, and suddenly you're looking at your economy wondering what exactly runs on Canadian inputs. And the answer, as we've discussed before, is almost everything that matters. He drew the Berkshire parallel with precision. At Berkshire, we've lost partners before, suppliers who found better customers, subsidiaries that were acquired by competitors, key employees who decided to leave. And every single time, without exception, the departing partner's importance was underestimated until the day they left. You think you can replace them. You think the relationship was one of convenience, not necessity. And then you spend 6 months and tens of millions of dollars discovering that what they provided was far more embedded in your operations than you ever understood. If you look at the relationship between the United States and Canada, the scale of integration is something most people don't fully appreciate until they stop and think about it. For roughly 70 years, the two economies have been built together piece by piece. Pipelines worth tens of billions of dollars were constructed to move Canadian energy south. Electrical grids were connected so closely that power flows across the border every day as if it were the same country. Supply chains evolved over decades until a single product could cross the border several times before it finally reaches the customer. Even defense systems and infrastructure were designed with cooperation in mind, with shared radar systems, intelligence networks, and resource agreements that support tens of millions of people. When you add it all together, you are looking at trillions of dollars of physical investment and decades of planning that assumed one very simple thing, that the relationship would continue. In business, we have a term for investments like that. We call them sunk costs. Once the money has been spent building pipelines, factories, transmission lines, and supply networks, that capital can't easily be redirected somewhere else. It was designed for a specific relationship. And when a relationship changes, those sunk costs can quickly become stranded assets. A pipeline only has value if the other side still wants the oil. An assembly plant designed around cross-border components only works if those components keep arriving. Infrastructure doesn't move very easily. What moves is the relationship between the partners who built it. One of the biggest mistakes companies make, and countries are not that different from companies, is assuming that their most reliable partner has no alternatives. Canada has always had options. Access to the Pacific allows Canadian resources to reach Asian markets. Trade agreements with Europe open doors to hundreds of millions of customers. Partnerships with countries like India and the broader Commonwealth create additional economic opportunities. Canada did not remain tied to the American market because it had no choice. It stayed because, for a very long time, the relationship created value for both sides. But relationships in business are investments, and every investment eventually gets evaluated again. If the benefits remain high and the costs remain reasonable, the partnership continues. If the benefits begin to shrink while the costs and uncertainty rise, people start looking for other opportunities. That isn't emotional. It's simply how rational decision-making works in business and in economics. Over the years, I've seen many companies learn a very expensive lesson. They assume that a partner who has been patient and dependable will always remain that way. They start taking that reliability for granted. They believe that because the partner stayed yesterday, they will stay tomorrow. But patience isn't the same thing as dependence, and silence isn't the same thing as agreement. When a partner eventually decides the relationship no longer makes sense, the departure often looks sudden to the people who benefited from it the most. In reality, the decision was usually building for a long time. And that's really the key point. The value of a partnership is often invisible while it exists. You only begin to understand how much it mattered when the possibility of losing it becomes real. At that point, the question isn't about blame or politics. The question becomes much simpler. Can the relationship still create enough value for both sides to continue? Or has the economic logic that sustained it for decades begun to change?